video, we're going to be discussing the overall causes of the Civil War, and I mean that in a thematic way. We're not going to be going into specifics about laws, actions, or individual people that helped lead to the Civil War. Instead, we're going to be talking about the umbrella themes that all those eventual actions and laws that they fall under. So first up, you have to understand sectionalism. The Civil War was really in part caused because of the different philosophies of the two major sections of the country. It was the North versus the South. And both of those regions had their own economics, own politics, and own interests that helped really guide them and in effect cause a splinter between the two regions. So within this, we're going to be discussing two major themes. Politics. So we're going to start out with going over what the federal government was like, which should basically be a review of how the US government is established and the realities of politics at this time period. But first, before we talk about politics, we're going to talk about economics. Economics, by some historians, really consider it to be the actual true, at the heart of it, cause of the Civil War. So we're going to be explaining the different economic systems of both regions of the country, the North and the South, because they are entirely different and they were not very complementary. They were competitive, and how those different economic systems of the two regions of the country really helped contribute to the sectional tensions that led to the Civil War. So let's go ahead and get started with going over economics. The northern economy can be described as industrial. Factories sprang up in northern cities, providing a wealth of jobs and economic growth. In fact, the overwhelming majority of all manufacturing and industry in the United States took place in the North. The opportunities that free labor, meaning that people were able to work where they chose to, move around if they wanted to, that free labor opportunity in the North presented in many of those northern cities brought a multitude of immigrants into the United States. Additionally, northern cities needed to transport all the manufactured goods that they were creating, making it to markets all across the country in order for people to be able to purchase everything they were making. So in order to do that, they had to construct many canals and railroads all across the northern part of the United States. So canals really boomed across the rivers across the north, like the Erie Canal created, and as a result of the need to transport goods across the state of New York, and a huge amount of railroad lines were laid in order to ship northern manufactured goods. The southern economy, however, stood out in complete contrast with the northern economy. The South was almost entirely agricultural, with very few factories or work opportunities outside of farming. The key, however, to the southern economy was the plantations, although there weren't that many compared to the vast amount of small farmers that were in the South. But the majority of crops that made a lot of the southern economy work were grown on these plantations. The major crops grown on the large southern plantations included tobacco, rice, and most importantly, cotton. Cotton was so key to the southern economy that it is often referred to as King Cotton. In fact, cotton was so profitable that some of the world's very first millionaires were southern cotton planters. Now, these southern plantations, unlike northern factories, were dependent upon slave labor in order to produce their crops. And although the majority of white Southerners did not own slaves, slave labor was the backbone of the Southern economy. So, with these differing economies, the big issue was trade. Typically having differing economies isn't what's going to be causing a problem, but trade was the issue between northern and southern economies, specifically in regards to tariffs. Tariffs are taxes on imported goods. So items that enter the country from foreign nations are then given an extra tax if there is a tariff applied. The North wanted protective tariffs. Theoretically, tariffs increase the prices of foreign-made goods, making consumers more likely to buy American-made products. Therefore, this would help American manufacturers make money by decreasing foreign competition. This would be why the northern manufacturing cities really supported tariffs to make sure that Americans bought their goods rather than foreign-made goods. So by making those foreign-made goods more expensive by putting a tariff on them. The South, however, wanted free trade, so absolutely no tariffs. Free trade results in an increase in trade between foreign nations. The South wanted free trade due to the fact that the majority of their cotton was sold to overseas markets, especially in Great Britain. Southern cotton was extremely important to American trade in general, as by 1850, over 50% of all U.S. exports were Southern cotton. So, if the United States put tariffs on foreign imports, those nations would in turn put tariffs on American goods entering their nations, therefore increasing the price of Southern cotton abroad. With competition in the cotton market, the South needed to keep their prices low in order to ensure their cotton was purchased. So in effect, tariffs would help the Northern economy, but would absolutely hurt the Southern economy. And any government action taken on tariffs would be seen as favoring one region of the country over the other. The tariff issue actually reached its peak with the Nullification crisis of 1832. In 1828, a strong protective tariff was passed. South Carolina ended up referring to this as the Tariff of Abominations. And led by then Vice President John C. Calhoun, the state launched a huge opposition to the tariff. In 1832, Congress and President Andrew Jackson actually responded to South Carolina's outrage by lowering the tariff, but it was still not enough to please the state. So in response to this lower tariff, South Carolina actually passed an Ordinance of Nullification, declaring that the tariffs of 1828 and 1832 did not apply to South Carolina, and they authorized the use of the military to enforce the nullification of these tariffs. President Jackson responded to South Carolina's actions by sending naval vessels into Charleston. Jackson then demanded that South Carolina back down on nullification, or else he'd lead the army himself into the state in order to enforce the laws of the United States. South Carolina did eventually back down, but not before they basically got what they wanted. Congress passed a compromise that gradually reduced the tariff over time until 1842, when the tariff went back down to its pre-1828 levels. However, Congress also passed the Force Act, which allowed the president to use military action in order to enforce the laws. The overarching consequences of the nullification crisis was that it showed a state could force Congress into doing what it wanted, while also establishing that the president had the authority to utilize military force against a state. To understand the reasons why the Civil War broke out, you need a basic understanding of the government and the political differences that arose between the regions of the country. The federal or national government consists of 3 branches. Each one of these branches has its own specific powers that the other 2 branches do not have. This is known as separation of powers. Part of the powers of each branch includes the ability to ensure that the other branches do not extend their powers beyond what is permitted in the Constitution. This is known as checks and balances. So the 3 branches of government include the legislative branch, which is known as Congress, and they make the laws. The executive branch, which includes the president and the cabinet departments, enforces the laws. And then you also have the judicial branch, which is our court system, and they determine the constitutionality of laws and executive actions. The Supreme Court is the highest court in our judicial system. We're going to focus more on Congress for a second here. The makeup of Congress has proved to be a major concern in the lead up to the outbreak of the Civil War. Congress itself contains 2 houses. The first house in Congress is called the Senate. Each state has 2 senators, so regardless of anything else, every single state has 2 senators in the Senate. The second house of Congress is called the House of Representatives. The number of representatives each state has is determined by its population. So the more people that live in a state, the more members of the House of Representatives that state has. So with the opposing economic interests in slavery becoming an increasingly important political issue, there was a perceived need to maintain a balance of power within Congress so that one section was not able to impose its will upon another section of the country. However, by 1860, which was a year before the outbreak of the Civil War, the nation included 18 free states and 15 slave states. The reason why there were so many free states is because nearly every single northern state had abolished, which means outlawed, slavery by 1820. Also, the North's population was significantly higher than the Southern population. By 1860, about 18.65 million people lived in the North compared to about 10.5 million people in the South. And of that 10.5 million people in the South, 6.29 million of those people were white, compared to 260,000 freed black people and 3.95 million slaves. So you can see how the North would have a much significantly stronger position in the House of Representatives and also in the Senate by the outbreak of the war. Another political issue leading up to the Civil War was the national disunity that was contributed to by the political parties. Imagine that, political parties adding to national disunity. By the 1840s, there were 2 major political parties. Although some smaller parties did emerge here and there were 2 major ones. One of these major political parties was the Democratic Party. This is our nation's oldest political party. In the 1800s, they generally supported rural and agricultural interests, making them highly supported in the South. Democrats also tended to support the power of individual states over the federal government. Democrats, however, ended up being divided sectionally into Northern and Southern Democrats. Southern Democrats feared the increasingly growing power of the federal government. They were specifically concerned that the president and Congress would not support or would perhaps harm Southern interests, especially in regards to the slavery issue. Northern Democrats, however, were not so much concerned with growing federal power. The other of the two major political parties by the 1840s was known as the Whigs. That's WHIGS. They focused on promoting a growing industrial economy and therefore found most of their support in northern cities. They also supported growing the federal government in order to promote a more industrial economy nationwide. So combined with the two political parties that were clearly growing and dividing upon sectional lines, and the issue with the membership in the House of Representatives and the Congress in general, you can see how the other issues that we'll talk about in later videos really helped contribute to the growing sectional crisis that led to the American Civil War.